Ladies and gentlemen, when we talk about people who grew up in the 1970s, we're not just talking about a decade, we're talking about a psychological training ground, a world that shaped attention, identity, resilience, and relationships in a way that's almost hard to imagine today. The 1970s were not curated, not filtered, not constantly documented. Life was more physical, more local, more face-to-face, and because it was slower, it demanded something many modern minds rarely practice: tolerance for waiting, tolerance for boredom, tolerance for not knowing. And that single difference changed how a whole generation learned to handle emotions, stress, and uncertainty. People who grew up in the 1970s were shaped by a rhythm of life that trained the brain differently, because the world around them did not deliver instant rewards, instant answers, or instant emotional relief. When entertainment is limited, when information arrives slowly, when communication requires effort, the mind learns a skill that modern life often weakens: the ability to wait without collapsing. This is not just nostalgia, it is psychology. A slower environment teaches the nervous system that discomfort is survivable, that boredom is not an emergency, that uncertainty is not a catastrophe, and that not everything has to be resolved immediately. Think about what waiting meant in that era. If you wanted to talk to someone, you might call a house phone and hope they were home. You might leave a message, you might wait hours or days for a response. If you wanted to watch something, you had to catch it at the time it aired, and if you missed it, you missed it. If you wanted a song, you waited for it on the radio, or you saved money and bought it. If you wanted to meet someone, you went outside, you walked, you knocked, you negotiated social awkwardness in real time. You couldn't just escape the moment by staring at a screen in your pocket, because the pocket didn't contain a universe. This built patience, but more than that, it built emotional endurance, the capacity to stay present even when the mind wanted immediate stimulation. Endurance forms in the space between desire and reward. When the reward is delayed, the brain has to tolerate the gap. In that gap, a person learns self-control, frustration tolerance, and persistence. That's why many people from that generation can stay with tasks longer, handle long processes, and tolerate discomfort without immediately turning it into drama. They are often less shocked by slow progress, because their early life taught them that progress is supposed to be slow. They experienced effort as normal, not as punishment. They experienced repetition as training, not as failure. That early conditioning can produce a kind of grit, the ability to keep going when things are not instantly exciting. At the same time, that same training can create a blind spot. When you grow up learning to tolerate discomfort, you can become so good at it that you stop noticing when you are suffering. You become a push-through person. You treat stress like a normal background noise. You treat exhaustion like a badge. You treat emotional pain like something to swallow, not something to express. The skill of endurance, if it becomes rigid, can turn into emotional suppression. The person looks strong on the outside, but inside they are carrying weight they never learned to name. They learn to wait, yes, but they also learn to endure in silence, and silence sometimes hides needs. The 1970s environment also trained the mind to be less addicted to constant novelty. When there are fewer options, you learn to appreciate what you have. You watch the same show repeatedly, you play the same games, you go to the same places, you make your own fun. This shapes the brain's reward system. Today, endless scrolling trains the brain to crave constant stimulation, and then ordinary life starts feeling dull. But in a world with fewer inputs, ordinary life does not feel like deprivation, it feels like life. This is why many people who grew up then can enjoy simple routines, a quiet evening, a walk, a conversation, a hobby, because their nervous system doesn't need fireworks every minute to feel alive. Another part of this keynote is the relationship to uncertainty. In that era, you often didn't know everything immediately. You couldn't Google your symptoms. You couldn't check what someone really meant by looking at their online behavior. You couldn't search for every answer in seconds. You had to live with not knowing. And not knowing, over time, builds psychological tolerance. It teaches the mind that ambiguity is part of life. This can create people who are calmer in uncertainty because their brain learned early that uncertainty is not automatically danger. They can wait for outcomes. They can sit with a question. They can hold a problem without panicking. But again, the shadow side exists. When you get used to waiting, you may also become less likely to demand answers you deserve. You may tolerate delays from others. You may tolerate emotional unavailability. You may tolerate being treated as fine. Even when you are not fine, you may accept slow pain because you're used to slow everything. So endurance can become strength, or endurance can become resignation, depending on whether the person learns to pair patience with self-advocacy. This keynote also touches relationships. People from that generation often learned that connection requires effort. You don't get instant access to someone's attention. You earn time, you show up, you keep plans, you make the call, you visit, you wait. That builds a deeper respect for commitment. It also builds a thicker skin, because you can't curate every interaction. Rejection happens face to face. Misunderstandings happen in person. You learn to recover, to adapt, to keep going. That is endurance in the social realm, the ability to handle discomfort without vanishing. So when you see someone shaped by that era, you may be seeing the product of a slower reward system, a nervous system trained to tolerate gaps, and a mind trained to persist through boredom, uncertainty, and delayed gratification. That can look like toughness, discipline, and patience. It can also look like difficulty asking for help, difficulty admitting overwhelm, and a tendency to handle it, even when support is needed. The key is understanding that endurance is not just a trait, it is a learned survival skill, and when it is balanced with emotional awareness, it becomes one of the most powerful psychological strengths a person can carry. Early independence in the 1970s often shaped people into strong self-reliant adults, but it also planted a quiet psychological rule in many minds. I should be able to handle this alone. That rule can look like confidence and competence, and often it is, but it can also become a hidden burden, because when self-reliance turns rigid, it doesn't just create strength, it creates loneliness disguised as strength. In many communities, children were given more freedom earlier. They played outside for long hours, navigated neighborhoods, managed friendships, handled conflict, and learned consequences in real time. Adults were not always hovering, not always negotiating every disagreement, not always translating every emotion into words. This meant kids had to develop problem-solving skills quickly. They learned to read situations, adjust behavior, negotiate with peers, protect themselves socially, and recover after mistakes. Psychologically, this builds a strong internal compass. You become less helpless. You learn that you can survive discomfort. You learn that you can figure things out. This is why many people from that era seem practical, resilient, and grounded. They're not easily overwhelmed by everyday problems, because their early life trained them to manage without constant guidance. But the same training often came with a cost. Emotional needs were not always centered. If you grew up in a time where adults were busy, stressed, working long hours, or simply raised with the idea that children should be tough, you might have learned that asking for help was inconvenient, dramatic, or weak. You might have heard messages like, "Stop crying," "Don't be soft," "Deal with it." Even if they weren't said cruelly, they were the cultural language of the time. Over years, the child's nervous system learns a pattern. When I struggle, I should minimize it. That pattern becomes an adult identity. I'm fine. I've got it. I don't need anyone. And people applaud that identity, which makes it even harder to outgrow. This is where the handle it alone mindset forms. It's not arrogance, it's conditioning. If independence was rewarded and emotional expression was ignored or discouraged, self-reliance becomes safety. You learn to rely on yourself because relying on others feels uncertain. You learn to solve problems quietly because emotional vulnerability didn't always get met with comfort. So the adult becomes capable, but also guarded. They might be excellent in a crisis because they can shut down emotion and take action, but they may struggle in intimate relationships because intimacy requires letting someone see your needs without shame. This keynote also explains why many people from that generation show love through responsibility. They fix things. They provide. They protect. They work hard. They show up. They may not use soft words easily, but they will do something practical to help you because that's how they were trained to express care, through function, not through emotional language. Sometimes younger people misread that. They might think they don't communicate, when the older person is thinking, I'm proving I care by what I do. Neither is wrong, but the difference can create conflict if it's not understood. Self-reliance also shapes how they process pain. When you're trained to handle things alone, you become very good at enduring. But endurance without expression can become emotional storage. Stress that isn't processed becomes tension in the body. Worry that isn't spoken becomes insomnia. Sadness that isn't acknowledged becomes numbness. Many self-reliant people don't know they are carrying so much until the body starts speaking for them. Headaches, fatigue, irritability, burnout. They might say, "I don't know what's wrong with me," because their whole life they were praised for being the person who doesn't fall apart. Another effect of early independence is pride. Not toxic pride, but identity pride. I survived. I figured it out. I did it myself. That pride can be beautiful. It fuels discipline and grit. But it can also block growth, because growth requires admitting you don't know something and asking for support. If your identity is built on being strong, you may secretly fear that needing help will expose you as weak. So you keep handling everything alone, even when it's costing you. This keynote also shows up in relationships as emotional distance. Many self-reliant people feel love deeply, but they don't know how to ask for reassurance. They may not know how to say, "I'm scared," "I need you," "I feel overwhelmed." Instead, they go silent, they get busy, they become practical. They might withdraw under stress, not because they don't care, but because their nervous system learned, when things get intense, isolate and solve. The partner might interpret that as coldness, but it's often a survival strategy. Independence is a coping style. The healthiest upgrade for this mindset is not to remove self-reliance, it is to expand it. Real strength includes the ability to receive. Real maturity includes the ability to ask. If you can fix everything but can't say, "I need support," you're not fully free, you're trapped in an old script. True independence is not, "I need nobody," it's, "I can handle life, and I can also lean on trustworthy people without shame." That balance turns early independence into a lifelong superpower: competence without loneliness, resilience without emotional isolation, strength with softness. People who grew up in the 1970s often carry a different relationship with privacy and dignity because their lives were not built to be witnessed, evaluated, or documented by a crowd. In that era, most experiences lived and died in the moment. A mistake was embarrassing, but it was not permanent. A bad haircut, an awkward phase, a teenage argument, a clumsy social moment. It didn't become a searchable record. It didn't become a screenshot that could travel. It didn't follow you into adulthood. That single fact changes psychology more than most people realize, because when you are not constantly on display, you learn to live for reality, not for performance. Privacy shaped identity formation. People learned who they were through direct experiences, family interactions, community feedback, and their own inner reflection, not through a constant mirror of likes, comments, and public reaction. They could fail in private, learn quietly, improve without embarrassment becoming entertainment. This often creates adults who have a stronger internal compass, not perfect, but less dependent on external approval. They may not feel a need to narrate their feelings, to announce their plans, to broadcast their progress, because their nervous system wasn't trained to seek validation from a wide audience. Their sense of dignity is rooted in the belief that your life belongs to you first. This also affects emotional expression. In many homes and communities, feelings were not discussed in the language we commonly use today. People felt deeply, but they didn't always have permission, vocabulary, or cultural encouragement to speak openly about it. So emotional life became more protected. Not absent, protected. That protection can look like emotional distance to someone who grew up in an era where sharing is normal and expected. But for many from the 1970s, privacy around emotion is a form of self-respect. They learned, consciously or unconsciously, that not everyone is safe to talk to. Not everyone knows how to hold your vulnerability. Not everyone should be invited into your inner world. This is why many people from that generation show depth through actions rather than declarations. They may not say, "I miss you," often, but they show up. They may not say, "I love you," every day, but they provide, they fix, they protect, they stay. They may not give long emotional speeches, but they will quietly make sure you are okay. Their love can be practical, consistent, and loyalty-driven. In a world that often equates love with words and visibility, their style can be misunderstood. But if you look at what they do over time, the pattern becomes clear. Their emotions are real. They just express them through responsibility. Dignity also shaped conflict behavior. When you couldn't broadcast your version of events to the internet, you had fewer tools to perform victimhood or win public sympathy. Conflicts were handled locally, privately, sometimes imperfectly, but often with a sense that family matters are family matters, personal matters are personal. That created a boundary between public and private life. Many from that generation still carry that boundary. They don't want their problems discussed in public. They don't like airing personal issues. They may feel uncomfortable with oversharing because oversharing can feel like losing control of your story. This is where the psychology of trust becomes important. Many people raised in that time learned that trust is earned slowly. You observe someone over time. You look at their character, their consistency, their behavior under stress. You don't hand someone access to your inner world quickly. So their vulnerability tends to be selective. When they open up, it often means they have decided you are safe. That decision is not casual for them. It's significant. And because it's significant, they may also be less interested in shallow connections that burn hot and collapse fast. They respect depth. They respect character. They respect people who keep things confidential. There is a shadow side to this, though. When privacy becomes extreme, it can turn into emotional isolation. If someone learns to never speak about their struggles, they may carry pain alone for too long. They may deny needs until the body forces them to notice. They may feel embarrassed to ask for help because their dignity is tied to being strong. They may keep relationships at a distance because closeness feels like exposure. This is not because they don't want love. It's because the nervous system learned that vulnerability carries risk. But the core truth remains: privacy and dignity are not emotional emptiness. They are a different emotional strategy. In that era, many people learned that you don't broadcast your life to prove it. You don't announce your pain to validate it. You don't perform your love to make it real. You live it. You do the work. You carry yourself with restraint. You keep your word. You handle things quietly. That restraint can look like distance, but it is often the opposite. It is a deep respect for what is personal. To understand people shaped by that time, it helps to shift the measurement. Don't measure their depth by how much they share publicly. Measure it by consistency. Measure it by loyalty. Measure it by how they behave when you are vulnerable. Measure it by whether they protect you, whether they keep your confidences, whether they show up when it matters. Because for many of them, dignity is not a performance, dignity is a value, and privacy is not a lack of feeling. It is the way they honor what matters most. People who grew up in the 1970s often carry a strong skepticism that is less about negativity and more about survival, a learned habit of trusting patterns over promises. Skepticism forms when a child repeatedly sees that life can change quickly, that authority can be flawed, that institutions can disappoint, and that adults do not always have control. When you grow up around uncertainty, you learn to watch carefully. You learn that words are cheap, appearances can be misleading, and what matters is what someone consistently does when the moment demands integrity. This, watch behavior, not words, mindset becomes a core psychological filter. It shapes how they judge character. They are often less impressed by big talk, flashy confidence, or emotional persuasion. They don't easily fall for charm if charm is not backed by consistency. They look for reliability, competence, and follow through. They notice whether someone shows up on time, keeps promises, does what they said they would do, and stays steady when things get stressful. In a modern world where image can be manufactured instantly, this kind of skepticism can look harsh, but it is often intelligent. It's a defense against being manipulated, disappointed, or emotionally exploited. This skepticism also shapes how they open up emotionally. Many people from that era don't trust quickly, not because they are cold, but because they learned that trust is a serious investment. If you grew up seeing people break promises, change their minds, disappear under pressure, or present one face in public and another in private, you develop a psychological rule: don't hand over your vulnerability too fast. So they may take longer to share personal feelings. They may test someone through time rather than through conversation. They may watch how you treat others, how you handle conflict. Whether you gossip, whether you exaggerate, whether you take responsibility. Their trust-building process is observational. They don't just listen to your words, they study your patterns. This is why they can appear guarded. Guardedness is not lack of emotion, it is protection of emotion. They may not be quick to pour their heart out, because in their emotional system, exposure is risky. They may have learned that once something is said, it can be used against you. So they choose restraint. They choose privacy. They choose to reveal slowly. That can frustrate people who want instant closeness, but it also creates relationships that are harder to break, because when they finally commit, it's not impulsive, it's considered. Skepticism also creates a particular type of loyalty. Once trust is earned, their loyalty often runs deep because it's built on evidence. They don't attach quickly and detach quickly. They tend to respect history, shared struggle, and proven character. They may not be emotionally dramatic, but they are often dependable. They may not say the sweetest words, but they show up. They may not celebrate loudly, but they protect fiercely. Their loyalty is not a performance, it's a commitment. And because it's a commitment, they don't give it to everyone. Another interesting effect of this mindset is directness. When you value behavior over words, you prefer clarity over ambiguity. You may be less tolerant of mixed signals, vague promises, or emotional manipulation. You may speak plainly. You may call out inconsistencies. You may not sugarcoat. This can be misread as harshness, but underneath it is often a desire for reality. They don't want a polished story, they want the truth. They don't want emotional theater. They want accountability. However, skepticism has a shadow side. When the mind gets too practiced at scanning for flaws, it can become overly guarded. The person may assume disappointment before it happens. They may keep expectations low to avoid being hurt. They may struggle to trust good people because their nervous system expects betrayal. This is where skepticism turns into defensiveness. It's no longer wisdom, it's fear wearing the mask of intelligence. The person becomes emotionally safe, but also emotionally distant. They avoid vulnerability not because they don't want connection, but because connection feels like risk. In relationships, this can show up as a reluctance to share needs. They might say, "I'm fine," even when they're not. They might handle problems alone rather than asking for support. They might test a partner's loyalty silently instead of communicating openly. They might assume that if they ask for reassurance, they are being weak. Again, the mindset makes sense if you understand its origin. If you grew up believing that people should prove themselves through action, you might feel uncomfortable asking for emotional confirmation. You want people to show you, not tell you. The challenge is that human relationships often need both actions and words. A mature upgrade is learning that asking for clarity is not weakness, it's healthy communication. This keynote also explains why many people from that generation dislike performative behavior. They can sense when someone is trying to look good rather than be good. They can sense when someone is using emotions to control a situation rather than to connect. Their skepticism becomes a radar for inauthenticity. They may not always be gentle about it, but they are often accurate. At its best, this watch behavior, not words. Mindset produces people with strong standards, stable loyalty, and a realistic view of human nature. They don't worship charisma, they respect character. They don't get hypnotized by hype, they look for substance. They don't trust quickly, but when they trust, they are all in, not because they are naive, but because the person has earned it through consistent behavior. People who grew up in the 1970s often developed a strong set of face-to-face social skills and a thicker skin for real-world interaction. Because their social life happened in physical spaces where you couldn't easily escape discomfort. There was no quick exit button like blocking, unfollowing, muting, or disappearing into a new digital identity. If you had conflict with someone at school, in the neighborhood, at work, or in the family, you still had to see them again. You still had to navigate the tension, the awkwardness, the repair, or the boundaries in person. That constant exposure to real social consequences trained a generation to handle friction differently, often with more directness, more practicality, and more tolerance for imperfect conversations. In local communities, social reputation wasn't built by images, it was built by behavior. People formed opinions based on what they saw repeatedly, how you treated others, how you handled conflict, whether you showed up, whether you were reliable, whether you were respectful. Because of that, many people learned early that words don't carry the same weight as actions. If you said something, you had to back it up, because people would notice. If you lied, it could follow you socially. If you acted unfairly, it could damage trust in ways you couldn't repair with a perfect post or a new profile. This shaped a social mindset that values accountability, and accountability tends to create direct communication, because directness reduces confusion. Direct communication, however, doesn't always look polished. Many people from that era speak plainly. They may not wrap every truth in soft packaging. They may say what they mean and expect others to do the same. In modern contexts, where communication can be highly curated and emotionally edited, that bluntness can be misinterpreted as rudeness. but often it's a reflection of how they learned to survive socially. Clarity was safer than vague emotional games. If you had a problem, you addressed it, or you moved away from the person. You didn't necessarily write long emotional explanations. You handled it in the real world. This upbringing also built resilience to disagreement. When you grow up dealing with people face to face, you learn that disagreement does not automatically mean the relationship. You can argue and still be neighbors. You can disagree and still work together. You can fight and still be family. That creates an important psychological skill, emotional separation, the ability to disagree without collapsing into total rejection. Many people today struggle with this because digital communication can make everything feel extreme. A comment becomes a war. A difference in opinion becomes betrayal. But in more local, face-to-face settings, people often learn to tolerate differences because they had to coexist. Coexistence built a thicker skin, not an insensitive heart, but a stronger ability to stay functional in tension. Face-to-face social life also trained reading of real cues, tone, facial expressions, posture, silence, energy shifts. When you communicate in person, you receive constant feedback. You can see when someone is hurt, bored, lying, nervous, excited. That makes many people from that generation better at sensing what is happening beyond words. They may not always use modern emotional vocabulary, but they can often feel the truth in the room. This is why some of them dislike texting wars or long digital misunderstandings. They prefer direct contact, because direct contact reduces misinterpretation and allows immediate repair. Another psychological effect is that friendships and community were often built through repetition. You didn't find friends by searching a global feed. You built bonds by seeing the same people again and again, on the street, at school, at local shops, in family networks. This repetition created loyalty because relationships were reinforced through shared experiences, shared time, shared presence. It also created social responsibility because you couldn't easily detach from the consequences of how you treated people. A careless action could echo in your daily life. That made social behavior more grounded, less performative, more real. At the same time, local community could also create pressure. When everyone knows everyone, you may feel judged, compared, watched. But that social pressure often produced a practical social intelligence, knowing when to speak, when to stay quiet, how to navigate different personalities, how to protect your reputation, how to avoid unnecessary conflict, how to stand your ground when needed. Many people learn these skills through direct experience, rather than through therapy language. They learn by trial, by embarrassment, by repair, by consequence. There is a shadow side here too. Thick skin can become emotional avoidance if it is taken too far. Some people learn to handle conflict by minimizing it, joking it away, or going silent rather than processing feelings. They learn to survive socially by not appearing too sensitive. That can create adults who are strong in confrontation, but weaker in vulnerability. They might be good at debates, good at practical solutions, but uncomfortable with emotional talks. They might prefer, let's move on, instead of, let's process this. This doesn't mean they don't care. It means their coping style was shaped in a world that rewarded toughness more than emotional expression. Still, the core psychology of this keynote is clear. Growing up in a face-to-face, local, less escapable social world often built direct communication, resilience to conflict, and strong social awareness. It trained people to deal with discomfort in real time, to read real cues, to repair when possible, to set boundaries when necessary, and to value practical behavior over public performance.